The wedding stopped when the doors exploded open, and the most dangerous man in the city walked in. You're not marrying him, you're coming with me. The air in the cathedral was thick with lilies and cold ambition. Amara stood at the altar, a vision in ivory silk, but the weight of her family's expectations felt less like a veil and more like a shroud. Her hands trembled. She wasn't a bride. She was a sacrifice, wrapped in silk, destined to marry a stranger to save a legacy she never wanted. The organ swelled and then died. The oak doors thundered open. The congregation gasped, but Amara's heart stopped for a different reason. It wasn't her groom standing in the light. It was Rafael Vega, the man who owned the city's shadows and a piece of her soul. He didn't run. He walked, with the terrifying grace of a predator. His eyes locked on hers and never left. You're not marrying him. You're coming with me.
Before we continue, we welcome you to AFRO-KOREAN Love Thrillers, the home of dark romance, forbidden passion, power, betrayal, and captivating revenge stories. Please do me a favor. Tap that comment section and tell us quickly where you are watching from. Stay tuned. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any new thriller that drops here. Sit back and relax because this story is just getting started. Now let's get back to our story.
The velvet curtains of the Moretti estate were always drawn tight, as if the very sunlight might tarnish the family's polished reputation. Amara stood in the center of the drawing room, her posture perfect, a habit beaten into her by years of finishing schools and the silent, judging gaze of her mother. To the outside world, she was the crown jewel of a political dynasty. To her father, she was merely the last high-value chip on a losing poker table. He is a man of significant influence, Amara, her father, Senator Moretti, said without looking up from his crystal tumbler of scotch. The amber liquid swirled, catching the dim lamplight. The contracts are non-negotiable. The marriage is already signed. Amara felt a cold numbness spread from her fingertips to her chest. She had spent 24 years being the intelligent daughter, the one who spoke 4 languages and never made a scene. She had studied law to understand the world, only to realize she was the only one in it who wasn't free. I haven't even seen his face, Amara said, her voice steady despite the roar of panic in her ears. You're selling me to a stranger to secure a voting block. Her mother stepped forward, the silk of her robe hissing against the marble floor. She reached out, not to offer a comforting embrace, but to tuck a stray hair back into Amara's tight bun. We are securing our future, darling. Love is a luxury for people who don't have legacies to protect. You will smile, you will wear the silk, and you will save this family from the debts your brother accrued. The room felt smaller then, the ornate gold leaf molding on the ceiling pressing down like the bars of a cage. Amara looked at the portraits of her ancestors lining the walls, stoic men and silent women who had all traded their souls for the family name. She was supposed to be the next one to vanish into the shadows of a powerful man's life. The wedding is in 2 weeks, her father added, finally looking at her. His eyes were as hard as flint. Try to look grateful. Most women would die for this position. Amara didn't feel like she was going to die for a position. She felt like she was being buried alive. She turned and walked toward the tall, arched windows, peeling back a sliver of the heavy velvet. Outside, the city lights flickered, vibrant and chaotic. Somewhere out there, life was happening. People were making choices. She let the curtain fall. The cage was locked, the date was set, and the stranger was waiting. She had no way of knowing that in the dark heart of the city, a different kind of man was already watching the Moretti gates, waiting for the cage to break. The rain in the city didn't fall, it bled across the pavement, reflecting the neon hum of a world Amara was never allowed to touch. She had escaped the estate for an hour, slipping past the bored security guard under the guise of a final dress fitting. The air was cold, smelling of damp asphalt and freedom, a sharp contrast to the suffocating scent of lilies at home. She walked with her head down, her coat pulled tight, trying to memorize the feeling of being a ghost before she became a trophy. The collision happened at the corner of 5th and Blackwood, where the streetlights flickered and the shadows ran deep. A sleek black SUV had pulled to the curb, and a man stepped out directly into her path. Amara didn't have time to stop. She slammed into a chest that felt like solid granite, the impact sending her skidding toward the slick pavement. She braced for the fall, but it never came. A hand, large and calloused, clamped around her upper arm with bruising strength, hauling her back upright. The heat of his grip seared through her wool sleeve. "Careful, tesoro," a voice rasped. It was a low, dark velvet sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. "The streets aren't kind to things as fragile as you." Amara looked up, and the breath died in her throat. She knew that face from the news reports her father tried to hide. The sharp, predatory jawline, the scar slicing through a dark eyebrow, and eyes the color of a winter sea. Rafael Vega, the man who didn't lobby for laws because he lived entirely above them. He didn't let go. Instead, his gaze traveled over her face with a terrifying clinical intensity, as if he were reading the secrets written in the tremor of her lips. Most people looked away from Rafael Vega. They looked at the ground, or they looked for an exit. Amara didn't either. She narrowed her eyes, her chin tilting upward in defiance. "I'm not fragile," she snapped, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a sudden, inexplicable surge of electricity. "And I don't need a lecture from a man who thrives on the chaos of these streets." A slow, dangerous smile pulled at the corner of Raphael's mouth. He stepped closer, invading her space, until she could smell tobacco, expensive bourbon, and something metallic. He didn't look at her like a senator's daughter or a political pawn. He looked at her like a man who had just found something he didn't know he was looking for. "Honesty," he murmured, his thumb grazing the inner skin of her wrist, finding the frantic rhythm of her pulse. "That's a rare currency in your world, Amara Moretti." He knew her name. The realization sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He released her then, stepping back into the shadows of his vehicle, but the air between them remained charged, heavy with the weight of a silent promise. "Go home, little bird, before I decide the cage isn't strong enough to keep me out." The following nights were a blur of restless sleep and the lingering heat of Raphael's grip on her arm. Amara found herself drawn back to the edge of the city, not as a runaway, but as a seeker. She found him in a place that didn't exist on any map, a refurbished warehouse overlooking the black glass of the river. It was the nerve center of his empire, yet when she was ushered inside by silent men with cold eyes, she didn't find a den of inequity, she found a sanctuary of brutal efficiency. Raphael was hunched over a sprawling mahogany desk, the sleeves of his charcoal shirt rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and ink. He wasn't barking orders, he was listening. He listened to a distraught shopkeeper whose storefront had been smashed, and then he spoke, his voice a calm tide that promised both retribution and restoration. When the room cleared, he didn't look up from his ledgers. "You're late, Amara. I expected you 3 nights ago." "I'm not a dog to be whistled for," she replied, stepping into the circle of amber light cast by his desk lamp. He finally looked at her, and the intensity in his gaze made the air in the room feel thin. "No, dogs are loyal because they have to be. You're here because you're curious if the monster has a heart, or just a very efficient ledger." Amara moved closer, her eyes falling on a stack of handwritten letters on his desk, requests for help, thank you notes from neighborhoods the police ignored, and tactical maps of the city's underbelly. This wasn't just crime, it was a parallel government. She saw the man behind the myth then, a strategist who had built a kingdom out of the debris her father's colleagues left behind. He wasn't just a chaos bringer, he was the one who kept the chaos from devouring the weak. "They call you the King of Shadows," she whispered, her fingers trailing over the cold wood of his desk. "Shadows are the only place where the truth doesn't burn," Raphael said, standing up. He moved around the desk, his presence overwhelming the small space between them. He reached out, not to grab her, but to lift a lock of her hair that had fallen loose. "Your father deals in light and lies. I deal in darkness and blood. Tell me, Amara, which one feels more like home?" He didn't wait for an answer. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You think you're here to study me, but I've been studying you. You don't want a husband, you want a purpose, and I'm beginning to think I'm the only one who can give it to you." The fascination in his eyes was no longer just curiosity, it was a claim. Amara realized with a jolt of terror and thrill that while her family wanted her for her name, Rafael Vega wanted her for her fire. The air inside the obsidian room was a suffocating blend of expensive perfume and whispered treachery. This was where the city's elite came to sin in tailored suits, safely tucked away behind velvet ropes and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Amara walked through the haze of cigar smoke, her dress, a shimmering sheath of midnight blue, feeling like armor. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be at a bridal fitting, pinning lace that felt like a shroud. She found Raphael in a secluded booth at the far end of the balcony, overlooking the writhing dance floor. He was alone, a glass of amber liquid untouched before him. He didn't look up as she sat down, but the air around him shifted, tightening with a sudden, localized gravity. "A private club, Amara?" he asked, his voice cutting through the thumping bass of the music below. "You're getting bold. Or desperate." "My father is meeting your associates in the back room," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They're discussing the security for the wedding. They're discussing how to use your silence to buy their votes." Raphael finally looked at her, his winter sea eyes tracking the frantic pulse in her throat. "And what are you doing here? Trying to negotiate your own terms?" "I want to know why you're letting it happen," she challenged, leaning forward until the heat radiating from him made her skin itch. "You could crush this alliance in a night. Why let them sell me to a man who will use me as a prop?" Raphael set his glass down with a soft clink that sounded like a gunshot. He moved with that terrifying, predatory speed, leaning in until their foreheads nearly touched. "Because I wanted to see if you'd fight for yourself first," he growled. "I don't save people who want to be victims, Amara. But you're standing in the devil's kitchen, asking why he hasn't turned off the stove." The lines blurred then. The distance between the good daughter and the monstrous king vanished. Amara reached out, her fingers trembling as she gripped the lapel of his coat. It wasn't a plea, it was a tether. For a heartbeat, the noise of the club died away, leaving only the sound of their shared breath. Raphael's hand came up, his palm cupping her jaw, his thumb dragging slowly across her lower lip. It was an intimate, dangerous gesture that spoke of a hunger more profound than power. "You're playing with a war you don't understand," he whispered, his eyes dropping to her mouth. "Then teach me," she breathed. The tension was a physical weight, a bridge built on negotiated desires and forbidden truths. Raphael looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, Amara saw a flicker of something that wasn't calculated. It was a raw, aching recognition. He didn't just want to disrupt the wedding, he wanted to disrupt her soul. The gala for the Unity Initiative was a masterclass in hypocrisy. Amara moved through the ballroom like a ghost in a gold-spun cage, her hand resting on the arm of her fiancé, Julian, a man with a smile as artificial as his family's philanthropy. While the champagne flowed, the air felt predatory. Her father was locked in a corner with the governor, their whispers building the very walls that would soon entomb her. When the senator stepped away to take a call, Julian's grip on her arm tightened. His mask of the charming politician slipped, revealing a sneering entitlement. "You look lovely, Amara," he murmured, his voice leaning too close to her ear, smelling of gin and malice. "But try to look less like you're at a funeral. I'm paying a high price for this union, and I expect a return on my investment." Amara pulled back, but the ballroom felt suddenly crowded, the exits blocked by Julian's private security. She felt the trap closing, until a shadow detached itself from the mahogany pillars. Raphael didn't belong here, yet he dominated the room without saying a word. He didn't wear the forced smile of the elite. He wore the cold assurance of a man who owned the land the buildings sat on. Julian bristled as Raphael approached, his face turning a mottled red. "Vega, this is a private event. You weren't invited." "I don't wait for invitations when I smell rot," Raphael replied, his voice a low rumble that silenced the nearby conversations. He stepped between Amara and her fiancé, his physical presence acting as a literal shield. He looked at Julian's hand, still clamped around Amara's wrist, with the detached interest of a butcher looking at a side of beef. "Let her go." "She's my future wife," Julian spat, though he took a reflexive step back. "She's a person. You're bruising," Raphael corrected. He didn't raise his voice, but the threat was so palpable that Julian's hand dropped as if burned. Raphael turned to Amara, his expression softening by a fraction, a look reserved only for her. "The back exit is clear. My car is waiting." "She isn't going anywhere with you," Julian hissed, signaling his guards. But as the men moved forward, 3 of Raphael's shadows materialized from the crowd, their hands resting meaningfully under their coats. The standoff lasted only seconds before the politicians realized that their influence ended where Raphael's reach began. In the quiet of the rain-slicked alleyway, Amara breathed in the cool night air, the adrenaline finally ebbing. Raphael stood a few feet away, watching the perimeter, his vigilance absolute. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "My father will double the security now." "Your father is the one who let him touch you," Raphael said, turning to her. The light from a street lamp caught the hard line of his jaw. "The world thinks I'm the threat, Amara, but I'm the only one in the city who isn't trying to buy a piece of you." Amara looked at him and realized the terrifying truth. The monster was the only one keeping the wolves at bay. The silence of the Moretti estate was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against Amara's chest as she stared at the wedding dress hanging in the center of her room. The lace was exquisite, hand-stitched by women who didn't know they were sewing a shroud. In the moonlight, the gown glowed like a ghost, a reminder of the woman she was supposed to become at sunrise. A silent partner, a political asset, a name crossed off a ledger. Amara walked to the mirror, tracing the faint purple shadow on her wrist where Julian had gripped her. The bruise was fading, but the memory of the coldness in his eyes remained. Her family spoke of duty as if it were a holy calling, a noble sacrifice for the greater good of a name that had done nothing but take from her. If she walked down that aisle, she would be saving her father's career and her brother's skin, but she would be murdering the woman who had stood in the rain with Raphael Vega. She thought of Raphael, not the king of shadows, but the man who looked at her as if she were the only truth in a city built on lies. Her heart was a traitor, beating a frantic rhythm against the cage of her ribs every time his name crossed her mind. With him, the world was dangerous, violent, and unpredictable, yet it was the only place she felt she could breathe. To choose him was to choose war. It was to invite a storm that would tear her family's house down to the foundations. She picked up a small silver burner on her vanity and lit a single match. The flame flickered, reflecting in her wide, dark eyes. She thought of her mother's words about legacies and her father's cold demands. Then she thought of Raphael's voice whispering that she was the only one who had a choice. The struggle wasn't between two men. It was between the life she had been told to live and the soul she had finally found. Amara reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the delicate silk of the wedding gown. She could almost feel the weight of the veil, the finality of the I do. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes like a warning. The city lights beckoned from beyond the iron gates, a sprawling, dark kingdom where a man was waiting for a sign. Amara blew out the match, leaving the room in darkness. She had spent her whole life being the perfect daughter, the silent observer. But as she looked at the dress one last time, she realized that some cages were meant to be burned, even if the fire consumed everything she had ever known. The morning arrived not with a sunrise, but with a cold, oppressive gray that bled through the stained glass of the cathedral. The air inside was ancient, smelling of floor wax and frankincense, a hollow sanctuary for a hollow union. Amara felt like a ghost haunting her own life as the heavy doors groaned open. The walk down the aisle was an eternity measured in heartbeat thuds. Every face in the pews was a mask of calculated approval, the city's elite, her father's donors, the architects of her imprisonment. At the end of the long red carpet stood Julian, looking every bit the rising political star in his pristine tuxedo. To anyone else, he was a savior. To Amara, he was the final nail in the coffin. Her father's hand was firm on her elbow, guiding her with a grip that warned against any last-minute defiance. He leaned in, his voice a low hiss beneath the swelling organ music. "Smile, Amara. The world is watching." She reached the altar, the weight of the silk train behind her feeling like a leaden anchor. The priest's voice began to drone, a rhythmic incantation of laws and traditions that felt like a death sentence. "Do you take this man?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Amara looked up at the vaulted ceiling, searching for an escape, for a sign, for a shadow to break the blinding light of the chandeliers. The silence stretched too long. A restless murmur rippled through the guests. Julian's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer, his whisper a sharp blade. "Say it, Amara. Don't be a fool." Her breath hitched in her throat. This was the moment of no return, the threshold where her soul would be signed away. Amara looked at the ring in Julian's hand, a diamond that sparkled with the cold brilliance of a prison cell. The priest cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a gavel. He repeated the prompt, his eyes expectant. Amara opened her mouth, but the words were stuck, anchored by the memory of a man who told her she was the only one with a choice. The silence in the cathedral became absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air from her lungs. The I do was a mountain she couldn't climb. Just as the first tear escaped her eye, the heavy oak doors at the back of the church didn't just open, they shivered under the force of a sudden, violent intrusion. The altar of silence was about to be shattered. The crash of the oak doors against the stone walls sounded like a thunderclap, echoing through the hollow ribs of the cathedral. The organist's fingers slipped, a discordant note screeching into the sudden silence. Heads turned in a synchronized wave of shock as Raphael Vegas stepped into the sanctuary. He wasn't dressed for a wedding, he was dressed for a takeover. In a sharp black coat that seemed to absorb the flickering candlelight, he moved down the aisle with the slow, terrifying confidence of a man who had already won. The gasps of the congregation were a frantic backdrop to the heavy thud of his boots. Amara's father surged forward, his face twisted in a mask of outraged power. "Vega, what is the meaning of this? Get him out of here." Raphael didn't even glance at the senator. He didn't look at the armed guards scrambling at the periphery or the groom who stood frozen in a mix of cowardice and fury. His eyes were a fixed, icy blue on Amara. He stopped at the foot of the altar, the space between them vibrating with the same electric current that had defined their every meeting. "The lady hasn't answered the question," Raphael said, his voice low but carrying to the furthest corner of the vaulted ceiling. It was a jagged blade of truth cutting through the artifice. He looked up at Amara, ignoring the chaos blooming around them. "Tell them, Amara. Tell them if this is what you want." Julian finally found his voice, his hand snatching at Amara's arm. "She is my wife. She belongs here." "She belongs to no one," Raphael growled, and for the first time, his hand went to the inside of his coat, a subtle movement that made the entire room hold its breath. He stepped onto the first tier of the altar, extending his hand toward her. "Tell them you want this, and I'll walk out that door. Tell them you want him, and I'll burn this city down before I let them hurt you again. But you have to say it." Amara looked at Julian, seeing only the cold ambition of a man who viewed her as a trophy. Then she looked at Raphael, the man who had offered her nothing but a dangerous, honest freedom. The veil felt like a noose. The silk felt like a shroud. "I don't," she whispered. The words were small, but in the vacuum of the cathedral, they were a landslide. She reached out, her trembling fingers meeting Raphael's steady, warm palm. The contact was a spark to a powder keg. Julian erupted in a shout, and security moved in, but Raphael simply pulled her toward him, shielding her body with his own. "Then she's leaving," Raphael announced to the room, his authority absolute. As Amara stepped off the altar, leaving the ring and the life she was supposed to lead behind on the cold stone, she didn't look back. She walked toward the light of the open doors, a runaway bride tied to the King of Shadows, finally choosing the storm over the cage. The sanctuary was a wreckage of reputations by the time the tires of Raphael's SUV screeched against the cathedral's cobblestones. Inside the armored vehicle, the silence was a physical weight, broken only by the frantic chime of Amara's phone. She looked down at the screen. "Father" flashed in the dark, followed by a string of vitriolic texts that blurred before her eyes. "You are no longer a Moretti. You are dead to this family. You have cost us everything." "Turn it off," Raphael said, his voice unusually quiet as he steered them through the labyrinthine backstreets of the city. Amara did as she was told, the screen going black, reflecting her own pale face. The adrenaline that had carried her off the altar was beginning to ebb, leaving a cold, hollow ache in its wake. She had traded a gilded cage for a moving fortress, and the world she had known for 24 years had vanished in the rearview mirror. "The Alliance is dead," she whispered, more to herself than him. "The governor, the senator, the investors, they won't just be angry. They'll be hunted. My father's career is over by sunset." "Your father's career was built on the bones of people he stepped on," Raphael replied, his gaze flicking to the side mirror. A black sedan was trailing them 3 cars back. The hunt had already begun. "He didn't lose a daughter today, Amara. He lost a commodity. There's a difference." The political backlash was instantaneous. As they crossed into the industrial district, the radio hummed with breaking news reports, scandal, kidnapping, and the collapse of the Unity Initiative. The Morettis had already released a statement disowning her, painting her as a victim of a Mafia abduction to save their own political skin. They weren't coming to rescue her. They were coming to erase the embarrassment she had become. Raphael pulled into a fortified warehouse, the heavy iron gates hissing shut behind them. He stepped out and opened her door, offering his hand once more. This time, there was no lace or silk to hold her back. "You're in the shadows now," he said, looking at the city skyline where the lights of the elite still twinkled, oblivious to the war brewing beneath them. "There is no going back. They will come from me to get to you, and they will come for you to hurt me." Amara stood tall, the wind whipping her tangled hair across her face. She looked at the man who burned her world down just to give her a match. I knew the price when I took your hand, Raphael. I'm not a Moretti anymore. I'm just yours. Let them come." The first day of war had begun, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the city didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a battlefield. The glass-walled penthouse offered a panoramic view of the kingdom Raphael ruled and the one Amara had burned. The air inside was thick with the scent of rain and the metallic tang of gun oil as Raphael's men moved like ghosts through the corridors. For the first time since the cathedral, the world was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath before a scream. Amara stood by the window, the city lights below looking like scattered diamonds on a bed of black velvet. Raphael approached from behind, his presence a steady heat against her back. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the tension radiating from his frame. "You should move away from the glass," he murmured, his eyes scanning the dark skyline with a hunter's instinct. "The fallout hasn't even peaked. Julian is a man who loses his mind when he loses his property." Amara turned, looking at the man who had risked everything to give her a choice. "I spent my whole life hiding behind curtains, Raphael. I'm done being afraid of what's outside." Raphael reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that defied his reputation. "You didn't just walk away from a wedding, Amara. You started a war. My enemies are forming lines with your father's allies. They won't stop until they've made an example of us." "Then I'll stand in it with you," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I'd rather be in a war with you than in a palace with him." A ghost of a smile touched Raphael's lips, but it vanished instantly. His eyes went sharp, his pupils blowing wide as he looked past her shoulder. In the reflection of the glass, a tiny, rhythmic pulse of light caught his eye, a microscopic bead of crimson dancing across the lapel of his charcoal shirt. It was steady. It was centered. "Raphael!" Amara started, seeing his expression shift to one of pure, cold terror. The red dot migrated from his chest to his throat. In that split second, the world slowed to a crawl. Raphael reached for her, his intent to shove her to the floor, to shield her with his massive frame. But Amara was faster. She had spent a lifetime anticipating the moves of dangerous men, and she recognized the finality of that light. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She stepped directly into his path, throwing her arms around his neck and pulling him close, her body becoming a wall between him and the night. "Amara, no!" Raphael's roar was drowned out by the sudden, sharp crack of high-caliber glass shattering. The impact was a physical shock that sent them both staggering back. Silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. As they hit the floor, the city lights continued to twinkle, indifferent to the blood beginning to bloom against the white silk of her ruined wedding dress. Love started the war, but who survives it?
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets you know when new videos drop. Lastly, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video.